part of my work is really helping people. They often come to me with a question like, what do I do? I'm in the soup. And my answer is, I'm less concerned about what you do and much more concerned about with who you are. So let's start there. And that's the heartbeat of my work, but it moves out into lots of other iterations.
Yeah. Well, good morning, everyone. We are here today on an episode of Up Next, and today we are over with Lisa Slayton over in Pittsburgh and then Michaela O'Donnell. I would like to say the last time you and I met, you were in Pasadena, but now you are in Nebraska. How are you guys today?
Awesome. Really good. Thanks for having us, Tommy.
Yeah, so fun to be
Michaela,
here.
I'll start off with you as well, too, in your role at Fuller. Talk a little bit about what you do at Fuller and also what you're doing in Nebraska these days.
Yeah, so great question. And yeah, Lisa and I are just really grateful to be here today. I'm the executive director of a place called the Max Dupree Center for Leadership that's housed at Fuller Seminary. So Fuller Seminary has its physical location in Pasadena, California. And as many of us know, and those of us in higher education know, education is all over the place and online and digital. So my team focuses on the digital aspects. And our charge within the seminary is not just for the folks who are going to be pastors, though we love them dearly. It's for all the folks who are in the marketplace who could benefit from a seminary education, even if they never actually come to seminary. So our job is to churn all that seminary stuff into small bit resources that help people on a Tuesday afternoon or a Wednesday morning. I will say though, Tommy, just because I know of the work that you all are doing, we do have what's increasingly an important program for us called the Doctorate of Global Leadership. And this is very unique. It's for students who have terminal degrees in things other than theology, MBA students, folks with law degrees all around the world who want to explore deep questions of faith work integration and get a doctorate while they do it. So that's a new exciting thing that I'm up to. And like you said, I do all that from Omaha, Nebraska.
Very, very good. Lisa, what about yourself?
Yeah, so Tommy, you and I met, gosh, it's been 15 or 16 years now, in Chicago back in the day. And at that time, I was deeply involved with an organization called the Pittsburgh Leadership Foundation, which is they're a network of leadership foundations nationally and globally. I still serve on the national or global board. I'm very committed to the mission of leadership foundations, which is really all about transformation of the city and how they go about doing that. Every leadership foundation has unique ways that they do that in their city. And in Pittsburgh, for the 15 years I was there, we focused very intentionally on equipping and developing first entrepreneurs. So we ran a leadership cohort in Pittsburgh. We actually did a year in Chicago with a group of people, which was super fun. And then that cohort translated into cohorts for pastors and for nonprofit urban ministry leaders. But for a long time, we were really focused, and there's a new iteration of that in existence now. I left PLF in 2019. And the part of the reason I left was my own sense of calling and vocation, which we can talk about a little bit, which is, I enjoyed parts of running an organization, but I did not derive joy from other parts of it. So I understand very well the challenges and the beauty of running nonprofit organizations. And I felt in this season of life where my best work could be in really working with individuals and teams and organizations in a much more intentional and deep dive way. So that's what I've been doing for the last 5 years is deep vocational work, team development, really helping people build organizational cultures that is embedded with all the things we talk about in the faith work space. And Michaela's organization has done some great research, which is really valuable in how we go about doing what we do, understanding how I go about doing what I do, understanding. And I seem to be have a niche with people, which is hilarious, that people find me or are referred to me when they're in the middle of a major upheaval in life, some kind of a disruption. Often it's career related, but sometimes it's more than that. And when we use the word vocation, which I'm sure we'll talk about, we're using the Steve Garber definition, which is bigger. Vocation is who you are everywhere you show up. And we can talk a little bit more in detail about what we mean by that. So part of my work is really helping people. They often come to me with a question like, what do I do? I'm in the soup. And my answer is, I'm less concerned about what you do and much more concerned about with who you are. So let's start there. And that's the heartbeat of my work, but it moves out into lots of other iterations.
Yeah. Lisa, when you were a child, right, growing up, and what did you think you were going to do, and what was your original path that you were taking on?
That's hilarious.
What made it change?
So I, for a long time, I thought I would be an attorney. I loved political science and history, and then I got to college, and in my freshman year, took a class in anthropology and sociology, and fell much more in love with the study of people and cultures. And that has, interestingly, my father, when I told him I was going to be an anthropology major in college, he's like, what in the world are you ever going to do with that? And I was like, that's a great question, Dad. I don't have a great answer. And for the first 15 years of my career, I was a retail merchant. I worked for both department stores and specialty stores. I worked on the wholesale side in Manhattan for a number of years, and then came back into the marketplace after having stayed home when my kiddo was young, and fell really in love with the practice of leadership, which led me into, okay, leaders are part of organizations, and this thing called culture feels very squishy. Nobody knows quite what it is, but it matters. So how do we help leaders understand their part and their role in creating healthy cultures? So I sometimes call myself a organizational anthropologist, because when I go into an organization, that's how I start. So that gives you my trajectory, but I am not a lawyer, although there are people who would tell you I can argue like one when I get my stubbornness up. So,
Michaela, what about yourself? What did you think? What did you start off doing?
It's funny, Tommy. Lisa and I have never had this conversation. We're good friends. We spend a lot of time together, but we've never asked each other this question. Yes. I also thought I was going to be a lawyer. Isn't that funny? I got as far as like I had the LSAT date, and I had all the books, and then I went through a really bad breakup. And that bad breakup sent me in a couple of, college kids in the US where we're having this conversation today often refer to these as gap years. I'm too old to have referred to it as gap years. I was just kind of running from my own life. Took me on a big path of pivoting and introspection and all the things. And I ended up studying theology. It just ended up being, I don't know, sometimes things get really obvious and you learn what you love, and other times you kind of follow the breadcrumbs along the way. One of the things that's true about me, though, and this, I mean, I don't know if, for listeners and watchers and all the folks that this resonates, but I always felt like I was a leader. And as a woman growing up, like, I'm like, what do you do with that? And how do you, is it okay to say that? And do I even want to be a leader organizationally speaking? Because that seems like a lot, and I don't know if I want to do that. And both in studying the Bible and in going to seminary, oddly enough, I really came into my own sense of who I was as a leader and how I could steward my own identity and gifts for the kingdom of God. And so that took me from being a lawyer who used my strategic brain to do all the things to being the executive director of a leadership center that operates as a nonprofit within higher education. So it's quite the pivot, but I am grateful for it, honestly, Tommy. Tommy, now I'm curious. You got to tell us your version of this.
Well, Michaela and Lisa, I graduated from Washington University in St. Louis, thinking as a chemistry major, I was going to go into med school. Mm-hmm. And after a first year of taking organic chemistry, I said, yeah, that's not going to work. So I became and got into the business school. My first job out of college, I got hired by a company called American Tower that built cell tower. Oh, and they said, okay, we just acquired 200 towers from Verizon Wireless. You see all those files? They came in, but there's no order to these files. Go organize these files. Michaela, Lisa, that was my first understanding of that faith work integration. I'm a
Mm,
college graduate from a pretty good university. Go get some intern to do it. But it really allowed me to say, Tommy, what the Lord was saying to me, are you faithful to where I have placed you? That
mm,
Mm,
wherever you go, can you do your job with excellence? And boy, did I organize that file room so well.
mm,
But what I didn't know is that God was going to use that, just like he used David and his time as a shepherd boy, to hone in me the skills of observation, of diligence, of sitting there looking at details, organization wise, spreadsheets, everything like that. And to this day, it laid the foundation of always being organized in everything that I did. And in
yeah.
a matter, I just worked in building cell towers for about 10 years, worked as a project manager, project director, and then from that, then I went into seminary at Moody Seminary, worked as a pastor for 3 years, realized, yeah, I'm not very good as a pastor. That's not my calling. Got
mm,
hired at Moody as special assistant to the president. Then after 3 years, realized, yeah, working in a top-down educational institute probably isn't my thing.
mm.
And then I just started doing, I'm probably best at doing multiple roles. And that's how Research Global came about for me as well, too, after about 10 years of trying to figure out what to do.
Yeah. You're
Wow.
very entrepreneurial.
Mm.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then for you guys, how did you two meet with each other? And how did this book come together, Life in Flux, that we're going to talk about today?
I can start, and Michaela, we'll tag team this because this story is kind of fun. So we actually met initially through a mutual friend and colleague, Mark Roberts, and Mark at the time was convening groups of people to kind of explore what was going on in the faith workspace. This was probably 5 or 6 years ago, maybe a little bit longer. And I was invited. Actually, I came to Chicago. I was up at Trinity with a group of people with Mark for a couple of days. And at the end of those days, we were all like, "This was awesome," and we don't really know why we were here, but Mark is wonderful at creating spaces for relational connectivity, and so that happened. And as we were leaving, Mark turned to me and he said, I want you to meet my friend Michaela O'Donnell, who's working at the Dupree Center. And so he introduced us, and we began talking and just conferring with one another. And then about a year later, we ended up on a panel at a conference called the Karam Forum, which runs for it's for seminary folks down in Atlanta, right before the pandemic, actually, about a year before the pandemic. And it was like, oh, we need to know one another. And that was sort of the beginning of it. So you can keep going, Michaela. Anything I missed, you fill in.
Yeah, I mean, that's how we originally met. And then we ended up in a prayer group. And Lisa and I we liked each other. I mean, we're sort of similar and we're direct. We also both had backgrounds in the marketplace before
Yeah.
we came into the faith work world. Lisa for a long time in retail, me for a decade owning my own creative agency. That was, I'm very entrepreneurial as well. And so there was just some similar perspective with obviously enough differences, because we're two different people. We ended up in a prayer group together. So we got to know each other on more of a friendship level, more of a heart level. And it was a prayer group for women who are leading organizations. And that felt really
Yeah.
wonderful because I hadn't had a lot of that before. And so then I knew I was going to write a book on transition, on change, on the inner work that God does in us in the midst of those seasons. And like Lisa said in the beginning, she's somebody who sits with people in those moments. So at the Dupree Center, we had done a ton of that work, research. We'd built a bunch of cohorts. We'd taken a lot of people through it. I had my own experience. I knew Lisa had a different perspective. So I just started asking her, hey, what do you think about this person? And what do you think about this idea? And she said sort of in jest one day, hey, I think I should write this book with you. And I was like, wait a minute. And so then we entered into a longer period of discernment, pretty intentionally so, that yielded in, okay, we're going to try to write, I'm going to bring you onto this thing and you're going to bring with you your gifts and strengths. And it was a real, I think the book is very helpful and good. We keep hearing that from people, but one of the greatest benefits for me personally was just the deep work of collaboration, something
Mm-hmm.
that you could say you value and do, but it's very different to do the actual give and take and to lean in and to still be, and I would say closer at the end,
Yeah.
not further apart. So that's kind of how the book came about.
Yeah. Michaela, random question. Even when you guys were writing a book, is it one of those things where you would write a chapter, Lisa would write her part, or did you guys come into a room for like a week or so and then just put post-it and start writing? How did that process go about?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think some of what I just described in terms of how it came about dictated how we uniquely went about this. So this was a book contract that I already had that Lisa came onto. So there were some voice issues that were kind of set up front, meaning that the book is going to be written in a singular voice. Yeah, a lot of people do the you take a bit, you take a bit. It just didn't, it actually, I don't know if we ever even sought out to do it. We didn't think it would work for us. So what we did was a lot of ideating, sometimes in shared space, sometimes over Zoom, a lot of ideating, getting on the same page, architecting, setting frameworks together. Then Lisa has this really wonderful ability to kind of plow, like, okay, let me make some space and get the blocks on the table. Okay, why don't you get some blocks on the table? Now I'm going to come in and we're going to talk about those blocks together and start doing some rewriting. And then by the time we get to the end, one of my gifts is just the synthetic thinking, the braiding of it all together. So then I would come in. So Lisa, we have multiple gifts going on, but I think it's kind of distinct. Lisa's a really good plower and I'm a really good braider. And so we wrote each chapter together, which is a little messier, but it also gave us a great, like, yeah, we really want this to go in, and no, we don't want this to go in. So yeah, I don't know that I would recommend that process
Yeah.
to everybody, but it produced the fruit that we were looking for.
Yeah. Hey, Lisa, quick question for you is, as you reflect upon the journey, I mean, your book is Life in Flux that you and Michaela wrote. What were some of the things when you guys were writing and said, man, we have to make sure this is in the book? But
Oh,
on the
boy.
flip side, what were some things where you guys disagreed on? And he says, well, we should put this. No, I'm not sure about this, but this is something. What were some of the points that you agreed on but disagreed on?
Yeah, I'll start with what we disagreed on. I don't remember a lot. I mean, I think we sat, the first thing we did together. I actually flew to Omaha a couple of summers ago, and we sat in a hotel room and coffee shops and lots of places for a couple of days, and really wrote the outline of the book, and knew that we were outlining, in some ways, a process. The book is linear because books have to be linear, but we knew there were elements to the process we wanted to make sure that we covered. And the things if I had to identify some things that we disagreed on, they were smaller things, but they were things that each of us had very different perspectives on. And we had to do the learning. Like one of the chapters, I think one of the most important chapters is coming home to yourself. And there's a space in there where the writing talks about trusting yourself. And I'm like, oh, I don't know if that's right. I don't know if I trust myself. Like, I trust God, but do I trust myself? And we went back and forth on that. And I did some study and learning and a couple therapy appointments later. And, and I'm like, yeah, this is really important. Like, this has to be included. And, we approach theology a little bit differently. There's a lot in there about the understanding of, the mystery and relationship with the Holy Spirit, the Trinity. And so I had a perspective, Michaela had a perspective. They ended up really blending together because it was more powerful that way. We agreed on a lot. Her experience. I mean, I've run cohorts for years. You run them, Tommy, so Michaela has run quite a few cohorts of different flavors through the Dupree Center, and it's the best container for transformation for people that I know of. I think we change and transform in the context of community, and there is individual inner work that has to be done as well. So it can't all be in conversation and dialogue. It has to be internal. And that was the heartbeat of the book. Like, what is this inner work that we want to invite people into that will guide you and ground you in times of flux? And all of my work since I left PLF in 2019 and started my own consulting practice starts there. who are you? What is the inner place? How do you can't be integrated out there if you're not integrated in here. So what
Yeah,
does it
yeah.
mean to be a highly integrated, coherent person inside, so that when the times of flux do come, you're not bandied about by the winds of change, which are, everywhere all the time, intensely.
Yeah, yeah. Michaela, let me ask you a quick question. I'm going to ask the same thing to Lisa. How did your own personal journey influence this book as you start
Mm.
working on it?
Yeah, thanks for that. Let me just tag on to something Lisa said, because I think that this is really important. Um, Faith work integration, if we're not holistic about it, can be seen as a template and action plan for how we behave at work in order to
Mm-hmm.
make decisions that line up with our faith. And what Lisa and I have observed, and both on the people and leaders and folks and workers who feel like they're flourishing, and folks who feel like they're completely falling apart, is that kind of integration that I just talked about and that Lisa alluded to is not possible without our own sense of what God is doing in us and how the different parts of us are connected as a whole in our being made in the image of God. And so, and I think that there's certainly, there's a possibility to say, well, that sounds really individualistic, and like that makes a lot of sense for a Western context. I think there's ways that it can be interpreted that way. And I think that we should have that conversation. But we're talking about people, about humanity. And so whatever the anchor point is, whether it's individuals or more of a collectivist culture and community, who we are in the context of our own lives and the people that we're with matters for how we're going to show up at work. You just can't do it without that, which is why Lisa and I wrote a whole book on this kind of inner work, this internal integration. We think it matters that much. And part of the reason we think it matters that much is not only the stories that we've listened to with others, but our own moments. When I look back at the story of my life, some of the biggest moments where God was growing me were these moments when life felt like it was upside down, when life felt like it was disrupted, when there was change happening, whether that change was in my family, whether that change was at work, and I've had both. Those are the moments. I look back at those, I'm like, oh, those were the inflection points. Those are the crucible moments. One I'll talk about sort of at a high level is I'm the child of divorced parents, and that shaped me. And the kind of change that our family went through was not just a season of flux, it was a decade of it, right? 2 decades in some ways. And out of that, I can look back and think, gosh, those were some of the moments of greatest pain, but also some of the moments where I really became the person I am today by God's grace in the context of my family, in the context of community. So our own moments really were a piece of it. But I really want to underscore that we cannot do this external organizational workplace faith work integration
Yeah.
if we're not doing the work that God is inviting us to do internally.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Lisa, what about yourself?
Well, one of the interesting things about writing the book together is, I am, I'll put it, let's see, how do I put it? I am a little bit older than Michaela. In fact, I'm the same age as Michaela's mother, just
Which
to
I
be
love.
clear. And so, I've lived longer. I've had more and different experiences. And it seems like in every season of my life, I could almost look at it decade by decade and say, there were major disruptions, major pain points that required me to go deep. And, earlier in my life, I did that in some ways, as I've gotten older, I've been far more intentional about it, far more thoughtful about it. I work hard to take the step back. I move fast. Michaela moves fast. We're both, forward, future oriented people. But doing that deeper inner work has been where I have experienced the most change. And we borrowed a phrase from Enneagram teacher Suzanne Stabile that says, life is, there are a couple of things we borrowed from her, but this is solitary work best done in community. And she asserted many years ago, and I agree with her, that we should always have a spiritual director, a therapist, and a coach. Maybe not all three at the same time, but we need those kinds of people in our lives when we're going through these things to help guide us and facilitate us. And I have done all three. Right now, I have a therapist I've worked with for 5 years. I have a coach. And I'm looking for a spiritual director. That will be, in the next year or two, because I need people to reflect back to me and tell me the truth. When you mentioned some of the contexts that you work in, Tommy, and one of them was, in a context where people don't often hear no, right? They hear what they want to hear. When you get into, particularly in leadership roles, that's true. People don't tell you the truth. They tell you what you want to hear because they want to please, or they're looking for approval. And I think we have to have those places where we go, where we hear the unvarnished truth from people who love us and care about us, people who are safe, but are not scared to say, hey, I see this thing going on with you and I'm paying attention and I want you to know I've noticed it. And I think it's something you need to open your eyes to. You're impacting others this way, or whatever it is. And that comes from having good guides. And every decade I can point to a season, in some cases more than one, seasons of very, very deep change. Like Michaela, I have a childhood history that shaped me. I grew up in a household with an alcoholic father who left to go get sober the day before I left for college. So I never lived in my house with a sober father. He did get sober and changed his life around, but that had huge implications for who I am as the oldest child. And so, and then how I've navigated that and integrated it. You can't ignore those things or pretend they didn't happen. You have to work with them and through them to integrate them, because they're part of who you are and part of how you become who God intends you to be.